Hey fashionistas, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we'll be learning how to draft a basic skirt pattern. So grab your tools and come along. To complete today's project, you'll be needing your rulers, your hip curve, a pencil, some tape measure, scissors, and a French curve. I'll also be using some heavy pattern paper. Okay, so first things first, I'm going to go ahead and roll out my pattern paper. I usually purchase this in bulk, and trust me, it is so hard to flatten when the time comes. But a little trick that I've learned is to basically roll the paper in the opposite direction and it flattens out perfectly. Then I'm going to go ahead and square off the edges of my pattern paper because it is not straight at all. So I'm going to use my ruler and draw two lines, one vertical, one horizontal at the edges of one side of the paper. We're then going to go ahead and make some markings. For this project, you'll be needing your waist circumference, your hip circumference, and the length of your skirt. I'll be using my ruler on the vertical line to basically make the notches for my length of my skirt. So the first marking I'm making is at 25 inches, which is the full length of my skirt. Next, I'm going to make a mark at 11 inches down, which is my hip position. And I'm going to do this at both sides on my paper and then square across. This is to ensure that you have a straight line going across and that your pattern isn't skewed in any way. So I'm going to go down at the 25-inch mark that I made and I'm going to square across as well. Unfortunately, it was out of frame, but just do as I say, not as I do. Next, I'm going to square across where my waist is, and I'm just brightening up the lines because I'm using a pencil and it may be a bit hard for you guys to see, so I'm just reinforcing those lines. Hopefully they'll be a bit brighter for you guys to see. Next, I'm grabbing my tape measure because it's so much easier to use than my ruler. And I'm going on the hip line and I'm going to mark in our hip circumference divided by 4. My hip is 44 inches divided by 4, which is 11 inches. However, I'm using a stretch fabric, so I'm going to reduce that measurement by 1.5 inches. I'm then going to add an extra ½ inch for seam allowance. If you like, you can always go ahead and label your lines. Here I'm labeling the hip line. I also went down and labeled the full skirt line, and you can also do this at the waist as well. Next, I'm heading to my waistline to mark in my measurements using the same calculations, which is the circumference of my waist divided by 4 less 1.5 inches for the stretch and adding a ½ inch for seam allowance. Going down to the hem of my skirt, I'm going to mark the same measurement I did for my waist right at that point. So it's going to be 7 inches wide. So now we're going to go ahead and connect these points. So we're first going to mark down from our hip to our hemline. And you're going to use a ruler for this section. You can use a ruler for your waist to hip line as well, but if you have a hip curve, then it is recommended that you use your hip curve to go and shape this hip out. As you can see, the hip is a bit pointy, so I'm going to go ahead and grab my French curve and smooth that out. You definitely need a smooth hip because if not, then it will be bulging and you'll see these points at the hip line. Next, we're moving up to the waist and we're going to make an extension about ½ inch high, and we're going to mark that point above the waist and connect it to the waistline. This is done to achieve a better fit of the skirt on your waist, and usually the body is very curvy, so we're going to curve out the waistline for a perfect snug fit. I'm going to go ahead and use my hip curve to create this new line at the waist, And as you can see, it curves a bit going out to the sides of the skirt. Next, we're going to work on our skirt darts. Usually we have darts at the front and back of the skirt, and since this is our front panel, I'm going to go ahead and find the midpoint at the waist. Here it is about 3.5 inches, and I am going to create some dart legs about 3 inches long, and we'd like our dart width to be about 1 inch, so I'm marking 1/2 inch on either sides of this point that I just made. Next, we're going to extend our dart legs downwards about 3 inches long and mark a point here. We're then going to use our ruler to connect these points to the waist of the skirt. I also went ahead to mark a small point about 1/4 inch above that line, and we're going to use it to connect these points instead of the original line. This is so that when we create our darts, there's extra fabric at our edges. So this will account for that extra fabric and you'll have a nice flat dart. And look, our front pattern is finally done. We're going to now move on to creating our back skirt pattern, which is essentially the same, just with a few changes. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and fold my pattern paper in half, and I'm going to use my tracing wheel to trace this pattern on the other side. Be sure to follow the lines as best as you can, especially the lines that curve, and make any special notches that you see fit while making your tracings. So I'm going ahead and I'm tracing my center front line here. I'm tracing my hem, and I'm going to go ahead and trace my hip line. After which I'll definitely go back in and reinforce, because the pattern paper is somewhat thick. So you have to basically apply some pressure to your tracing wheel. I mean, if you're using a thinner pattern paper, this process may be easier for you, but as you can see, I'm applying some pressure to ensure that the markings are made. I'm then going to go in with my ruler to basically reinforce these lines that I made. I'm doing a freehand drawing here, but I'm going to go back in with my French curve to smoothen these lines. So when creating your back dart, the only difference is the length of your dart. The back dart is usually longer, so we're going to create dart legs about 4 inches long from the center point of your waist. The dart width is just as before, 1 inch wide, so we're creating 1/2 inch markings on either side of the waist and connecting it to this dart point. And again, we're making our 1/4 inch extension for the dart point so that your dart sits flat and seamless. Next, we're going to work on our seam allowance or zipper allowance for the back of the skirt. Usually the zipper allowance is about 1 inch to 1.5 inches. However, I opted for a 1/2 inch zipper allowance at the back because I'll be using an invisible zipper and it doesn't really take up as much space. So I'm just taking my ruler, I'm going to connect these points here and then make an indication that this is my zipper allowance for the back of my skirt. So while creating this pattern, the seam allowance for our sides were included. So I'm now going to add seam allowance to the top and bottom of the skirt. So here I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance for the top and I'm going across making my markings and I'm going to smooth this out as we did before. Next, we're going to add seam allowance to the hem of our skirt and I'm using a 1/2 inch seam allowance to basically allow for the folding of the edges. And I'm going to use my ruler to square this across to create a nice straight seam. Lastly, we want to go ahead and label our pattern. So this is our skirt back and we are going to make an indication for the center back as well, your zipper allowance, and we're just going to go ahead and cut this out. We're then going to do the same for our skirt front and we're going to also draw in our grain lines. So this is what the pattern is looking like once it's done. I'm going to go ahead and match these up to ensure that they are the same length. They won't be the same width because our back skirt pattern will have the zipper allowance. Also note that the front skirt pattern will be placed on fold and you'll only need to cut this once, while the back skirt pattern will be needed to cut twice. Lastly, we're going to go ahead and add our grain lines. So as you can see, I'm using my ruler to create a vertical line that runs from the top to the bottom of the skirt, and this should be matched with the grain line of your fabric when cutting, so as to ensure that your garment fits perfectly, it is not hanging, it isn't drooping, and that all the lines match up. That's it for this tutorial, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something today, and I hope you'll make your own skirt patterns and share them with me on my channel. Leave a comment down below and let me know if you'll be trying this pattern out. As you can see, it is a very neat pattern and I'm sure the fit will be perfect as well. If it is that you require more detailed pattern drafting and sewing tutorials, leave that down in the comments as well. I really do enjoy making these videos, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.